with a whole lot of truth. The Remedy Revolution is here for you. Ooh. And now here's your host, Erin Paige.
All interviews presented on the Remedy Revolution podcast are designed to provide information and inspiration only. Guests of the podcast may present opinions and anecdotes which are solely their own. And as always, before beginning any treatment protocol, please consult with your preferred medical provider. Hello, everybody. Welcome to another episode of the Remedy Revolution podcast. So something happened recently, and I wanted to take this time to really dive into it. I know many of you have heard me state that many of the treatments, conventional treatments that were offered for my son's condition, which was PANS, or Pediatric Autoimmune Neuropsychiatric Syndrome, or PANDAS, Pediatric Autoimmune Neuropsychiatric Disorder associated with strep. Those particular disorders have long been considered treatable with various conventional methods. Those methods are primarily antibiotics, usually until about the age of 18, depending on the symptoms, the severity of the symptoms, and how much is resolved with those antibiotics, often used in conjunction with SSRIs. Those SSRIs help with some of the mood issues going on for many of these kids. Additionally, there is IVIG and also plasmapheresis, which is a bit more intense. Those are both blood product transfusions. So I wanted to take this time because just recently I had some questions. People were asking about how to treat PANS and PANDAS in a more natural way. And I realized that, going back through some of my recordings, I have spoken about the fact that we didn't choose to use any of those methods, but I really wanted to dive into why. So many of you have probably heard of the antibiotic gut issues and how that can really affect severely the gut-brain connection. And when we are continuously trying to kill things off in the gut, this is obviously a lot more widely known, not just in the natural world, but also in the mainstream world as well, that there is actually an issue with antibiotic resistance. So we're talking about people that have overutilized antibiotics, doctors that have overutilized antibiotics throughout the years, and actually substantially changed the gut microbiome. And unfortunately, what happens with that, as we are really starting to understand with much of the new research, is that the gut and the brain are so intricately connected that when we have a gut a microbiome that is dysregulated, we also tend to have a brain that's dysregulated. And unfortunately, this is part of the problem, which is why gut healing is so important in any kind of neuropsychiatric disorder. It doesn't matter what it might be. Even things like schizophrenia can be largely helped by regulating the gut and bringing sustainability into the gut microbiome. So the antibiotics piece, I think, is a little bit more widely known. So I don't want to focus too much on that. But I did want to talk a little bit about some of the other uses of these conventional treatments and why I chose not to use them. Now, I just want to make sure that everybody who's listening realizes that I fully recognize that there's a time and a place for things outside of the natural realm, and that if these are things that you've utilized that have really assisted your family, fantastic. There's no judgment here. I don't want anybody to think that I'm saying that these things are never good for anybody. What I do want to say is that there's very significant scientific reasons why I chose not to utilize those treatments. And so I really wanted to make sure that I gave people that information so that they could make an informed choice when it comes to treatment for PANS and PANDAS and any other neuropsychiatric disorders, mental health disorders, or things that you or your children might be struggling with, because ultimately these are not just treatments that are utilized for kids with PANS and PANDAS. They are utilized for, many additional treatments, including just in psychiatry for depression, particularly for a lot of moms. Postpartum can be a very difficult time. And the medical profession in general doesn't do a very good job of understanding the mental emotional state of mothers as their hormones are shifting and changing, and connecting that with a physical reason. And so often these mothers will come in maybe feeling physically run down, and that then causing some depressive type symptoms. And unfortunately, that's when it's typically recommended to utilize something like an SSRI. So while we're kind of on that topic, I just wanted to talk about, there was a recent meta-analysis that just came out. This was in molecular psychiatry. And I just want to read you the title of it. So those of you who are interested can go find it. I can also post the link in the show notes, but it's called the Serotonin Theory of Depression, a systematic umbrella review of the evidence. And it is a meta and large data set analysis. And this essentially means that it is a culmination of all of the data that was compiled by the various pharmaceutical companies, right? Because remember that the vast majority of these trials and investigative hypotheses were investigated by the pharmaceutical industry. So they have a vested interest in having a positive outcome. So what did all of these meta-analyses say? Essentially, they were looking for the problem, right, that we've been trying to fix with these SSRIs. So SSRI regulates serotonin. And the idea is that those with depression may have a deficiency in serotonin. What this meta-analysis said, however, was that that is actually not the case. We have zero scientific evidence to point to the fact that serotonin might be causing depression. And what I find so interesting is the vast majority of people that come to me, they say that they've been on an SSRI for a long period of time. And then I get children who come in who are just starting new SSRIs, and instead of weaning off one before they start another, they typically actually add the new one in before weaning off the first SSRI. And oftentimes there is no exit strategy. And this is what really frustrates me as a practitioner, because I get people coming in, they don't understand why they're on multiple SSRIs. They don't have any resolution of symptoms. However, there's still no exit strategy. They're continuing to take these medications despite the fact that they're not helping. Now, that's not to say that they're not helping anybody. Obviously, there are people who do seem to have some assistance from these SSRIs. However, I also believe that we really need to look at and understand, when going on some of these medications, what the exit strategy is first, before we start to enter into this slippery slope, if you will. Because now what some of these other analyses are finding is that there is a danger in weaning off these medications, particularly in people who've been on them for a long period of time. And some of those things have to do with decreased libido, which then can lead to lots more depression, frankly. There's also physical ailments, things that they're talking about called brain zaps, where essentially the brain is has like little electrical impulses, and there's significant impact on people's lives in going off of these SSRIs. So when I was faced with that decision, many years ago at this point, it didn't make a whole lot of sense to me, because looking at serotonin, there wasn't a deficiency. We were able to measure that. And so it didn't make sense to me that we would do an SSRI in order to help increase mood, if you will, because if there was no indication that that was actually the problem, then why would we go in and medicate for something that is not showing up on labs? So my first inclination is always to not to go ahead and medicate with things like that, but to look at what the root cause is. So is there gut dysfunction? Is there a lot of infections? Can we look and see, is there a neurological, inflammation? Do we have trauma. There are so many other reasons why we can be expressing things like anxiety and depression. So I think it's very important to really look for the root cause before entering into treatment protocols that contain things like SSRIs, particularly because we don't even have the evidence to support their use. And there are significant impacts that can be long-term. So that would be, one of the reasons why I decided not to utilize an SSRI for my own child. And then the second major one would be IVIG or plasmapheresis. So these are blood products meant to essentially reboot the immune system, if you will. The idea is to take healthy blood cells and to infuse them into the patient to then create a proper immune response. And it has been wildly successful for many people and extremely unsuccessful for many others. And that even varies from treatment to treatment. So there are some who might do really well with a few treatments, and then they take a break, and then they come back to it, and suddenly the IVIG doesn't seem to be working anymore, or it makes the patient worse. So there's a number of reasons why that might be. The first being the fact that these blood products are not just a single donor. So I think it's important to really understand that when you receive any kind of blood product for IVIG or plasmapheresis, these are an amalgamation of blood, sometimes from hundreds of thousands of people. We're talking about an impossible, it's like a needle in a haystack. You can't separate one from the other. So, you don't really know where the blood is coming from. And I think that that's a really important point. Just as a sidebar, if you will, if you want more information about things like that, check out Factor 8 in the UK. There's a website, I think it's factor8scandal.uk. Factor 8 is under severe scrutiny in the UK right now. That was a blood product that was utilized in plasmapheresis primarily for hemophiliacs, but also trialed on numerous children. By the way, there's significant evidence mounting that suggests that the doctors who were actually injecting these children knew that they were contaminated with HIV and hepatitis C. So as much as I want to believe that there are good-hearted people in the world, and I do, we have to be cautious, particularly in situations like this. So I don't know, and I don't pretend to know what the motivation was behind all of this. Perhaps they thought they were doing some good by, experimenting without their knowledge. However, I don't know. I know that as a mother, I would be beyond infuriated if that was something that was going on to my child. So check out Factor 8. Understand that even the products here in the United States, they do undergo some infectious disease testing, but it's not comprehensive. There are several things that are left out of those tests, particularly things that are going on in the last several years. So we're not testing for COVID spike protein, for example. And I'm seeing actually patients who have had IVIG coming to me with very, very high levels of COVID antibodies, just as one example. So we're talking about, just to give you a reference. So I had my COVID antibodies tested when I had active infection, and that active infection was around 500. And I had a patient come in to me who, number one, had been doubly vaccinated, and number two, had been undergoing IVIG. And her COVID antibodies were over 18,000. And so we're talking about absolutely insane levels of antibodies. If that is the kind of immune response that's going on in the system, how can the body fight off anything else? The immune system is already so taxed and busy. So ultimately, I think we really need to be cautious when thinking about all of these different treatments, particularly ones that do have the potential to cause harm. And I know that, there's a lot of parents out there that struggle with fear, with feeling as though they're failing their children if they're not doing the things that their doctors are recommending. But I do think it's so important to really do your research to understand what it is that you are signing up for before you sign on the dotted line, and to really dive deep into some of the research, because I can guarantee you, if you are going to sit here and read through these papers, you're probably going to be more informed than a lot of doctors out there. And I don't mean that as any disrespect. What I'm saying is that the vast majority of doctors are overloaded with patients. They don't have the time to significantly look through all of the literature or to understand. In fact, it would be great for some of the patients to bring them some of this information, because it's stuff that they might not be receiving. In fact, most of the research that they might be seeing on their desk is stuff that comes from the pharmaceutical reps. So they're getting their research, if you will, directly from the representatives for those pharmaceutical products. And of course, they're going to be favorable. So I do think it's very important for us to, as parents, as patients, be diligent in what we are putting into our bodies, understanding the reasons why we are doing so, and really getting to the root of some of that data. You are your own best detective. You know your body better than anybody else. And so for you to be able to understand what might work for you, I think it's really important to understand the etiology of some of these things, to understand why we utilize some of these treatments, and to understand too that I don't believe that doctors, for the most part, particularly in this world, are, greedy, pharma shills. I think ultimately they really are trying to do good. However, they're not equipped with the tools and the data and the science to back some of their research. And, a lot of that has to do with the fact that, the vast majority of these doctors, I've talked, with many other providers here on the podcast about how the vast majority of these doctors read abstracts, or the conclusion, if you will, of, various scientific papers. So they might have, 100 papers that they've read the abstract on, but that doesn't necessarily mean that they're well informed. You have to understand the data sets. You have to understand what kind of data they were looking for, because oftentimes, when you have a skewed study, a study that has been paid for by the pharmaceutical companies, again, who are then recommending their products to these doctors themselves, there's obviously going to be bias in those papers. So do your due diligence, understand that you don't have to be fearful, that the knowledge of these types of treatments is going to really assist you in knowing how to move forward and what's best for you and what's best for your family. There are, just to offer some hope, there are many other treatments out there. We've spoken about a lot of them on the podcast, things that are far less potentially damaging, that have far less side effects, and things that really can assist and bring about full healing. So I'm talking about things like supplementation to help heal the gut. Homeopathy, obviously, I'm going to advocate night and day for homeopathy, because ultimately, I've seen it work for many, many children. And the thing about homeopathy is we can address many of these issues. So we can address gut dysfunction through things like bowel nosodes, which very similarly to, fecal transplant, if you will, we're repopulating the gut with the healthy bacteria and overtaking the bacteria that maybe is not quite so healthy. Then we've got things like the nosodes. Homeopathic nosodes can take care of infectious diseases. Then we have sarcodes, which can help, heal some of the organs and tissues. And then we have the plant remedies, the mineral remedies, the animal remedies. The list goes on and on as far as what kinds of tools I have in my toolbox as a homeopath that perhaps, a conventional medical doctor might not have. And, when the tools in your toolbox are limited, you utilize what you can, right? If we're in a first aid situation and somebody has a giant gash in their leg and all I have is, a ratty t-shirt, that's what I'm going to use to try to help bandage up that wound. In the meantime, trying to figure out obviously other treatments. But unfortunately, when all you have is a limited number of tools in your toolbox, then those are the tools that you're going to be more apt to use. Additionally, there are things like herbal tinctures. I had Teresa Holler on the web or on the podcast. We talked a lot about some of the herbal tinctures, which can help detox the body and bring you into, again, a state of balance. We talked about with Dr. Natasha Campbell McBride just recently about all of the amazing things that diet can do for your body, how just eating the right foods to nourish your body and to give your body what it needs can help regulate and turn around any kind of illness or ailment. And there are so many who have really been helped and healed by things like the GAPS diet, which are very simple. We're not talking about rocket science. We're not talking about, millions of dollars. You don't have to be an intellectual. You don't have to be, extremely wealthy, but you do have to put in the effort. And I think that's where it becomes a little bit more challenging is, when you're putting in so much effort, you want to see results and you want to see those results tomorrow. And unfortunately, sometimes the symptoms don't go away immediately. You need time in order to heal. The body, it took time to get into its disease state. So in order to heal, we need to kind of understand and recognize that the body will eventually self-correct, but we need to give it the time and space to be able to do so, as well as the fuel. Anyway, I just wanted to make sure that I put some of this information out there because I know so many of you are really coming to some of these diagnoses now, whereas these are things that, I've been dealing with for over 10 years, I guess 12 years now. And ultimately, I think, so many parents that are now coming into the fold are being fed the same mantras that, I was fed as a new mom into that world. And I think it's really important that we understand that there are different ways of doing things, that I think it's time that the PANS and PANDAS community really take a long, hard look at some of the conventional treatments, understand what might be working in certain scenarios, and understand where we could be doing a better job of educating patients and giving them the help that they actually do need. And sometimes that requires, for example, a doctor to look to outside sources, look to outside providers to be able to assist instead of trying to work with the limited tools in their toolbox. Thanks so much for listening today. Please, please, please like us on Instagram at Remedy Revolution Podcast. You can visit the website, theremedyrevolution.com. You can visit my website, heartwinghealing.com, to learn more about homeopathy and treating with me. And I really hope that we can all bring about as much healing as possible. Thanks for listening. We'll see you next time. Take care.
As a guiding light through darkest days, we'll fight the night. With a whole lot of passion, with a whole lot of truth. Remedy Revolution is here for you.